Behind the golden lattices of Topkapi Palace, where sunlight entered only on permission, there has always been one question that refuses to die. What happened to the women who once ruled the greatest court in the Islamic world the instant their beauty faded, their wombs fell silent, or their sons lost the throne? The answer is simpler and far more terrible than any Oriental fantasy. Most of them never left. They simply ceased to exist while still breathing. The imperial harem, the harem-I-Humyan, was never the perfumed seraglio of European imagination. It was a political prison disguised as paradise, a labyrinth of marble and silence where entry was easy and departure almost impossible. Once a girl crossed the carriage gate, she belonged to the dynasty forever, body, tongue, future, even her name. A fortunate few rose to become Hayski sultans or Valide sultans and moved empires from behind curtains. The rest, hundreds, sometimes thousands at a time, lived out their days in graduated degrees of captivity, waiting for a glance that might never come, a pregnancy that might never happen, or a political wind that could snuff them out like a candle. When a sultan died or was deposed, the entire balance of power inside the harem collapsed overnight. The new ruler, often a frightened boy surrounded by scheming elders, feared nothing more than the brothers he had not yet managed to kill and the mothers who had borne them. So the old favorites, the former queen mothers, the sisters and aunts of possible pretenders were quietly retired. Not to country estates, not to distant convents, there were no such mercies. They were transferred deeper into the palace, past courtyards no map acknowledges, to apartments known simply as the Golden Cage. These rooms were beautiful beyond dreaming, were also tombs. Windows were bricked up or turned to face blank walls. Doors were sealed with iron on the outside and silk on the inside. Servants entered only in pairs, never speaking unless addressed, and even then only in whispers. Letters, if permitted at all, were read aloud by a Kalfa whose loyalty belonged to the reigning Valide. Every sigh was reported, every tear counted. The women kept their jewels, their embroidered kaftans, their rosewater and ambergris, because the dynasty demanded that even its prisoners look royal. But they wore them for no living eyes, except their own reflection in polished bronze mirrors that grew cloudier with each passing year. Handan Sultan, mother of Sultan Mustafa I, knew this fate better than most. When her son was deposed for the second time in 1618, the palace did not exile her. Exile would have been freedom. Instead, she was moved to a suite high in the third courtyard whose balconies had been walled in decades earlier. For the remaining 23 years of her life, she never again saw the Bosphorus. Her food arrived on golden plates, her gowns were changed twice daily, her hair was dressed every morning by silent girls who had been taught to pretend she was already a ghost. She died in 1641, still wearing the diamond Aigret her son had given her on the day of his first accession. The chroniclers record her death in a single line. The palace erased even that line within a generation. But the Golden Cage was only the most luxurious of punishments. Beneath it lay layers of subtler, crueler disciplines administered by men whose very bodies had been sacrificed to guarantee their trustworthiness. At the very apex of this invisible hierarchy stood the Kisler Agassi, the chief black eunuch, a figure more feared than any vizier, richer than most princes, and answerable only to the Sultan and the Valide Sultan. Taken as boys from the Upper Nile, the Horn of Africa, or the Christian borderlands of Ethiopia, they were castrated in the desert or in Cairo's infamous cutting houses, then shipped to Istanbul wrapped in wet sheepskins to keep the wound from closing. Those who survived the journey, fewer than 1 in 3, were dressed in white linen, taught Turkish and Persian, and groomed for absolute loyalty. By the time they reached middle age, the most ambitious among them could control revenues larger than entire provinces. They owned palaces outside the walls, fleets of ships, thousands of slaves of their own. Yet they could never leave Topkapi without permission, and permission was almost never granted. They were the perfect jailers, men who had nothing left to lose except the favor of the dynasty that had already taken everything. El-Hajj Bashir Agha, who ruled the harem from 1717 to 1746, was perhaps the most powerful of them all. He rebuilt the palace library, endowed mosques across the empire, and personally selected which princes would live and which would be quietly strangled at birth. Inside the harem, he was God's shadow. When he walked the corridors, even the valide sultan lowered her voice. With a single lift of one ringed finger, he could order a woman's world ended in a dozen different ways, none of them loud. The most common was the whip. It was never a crude instrument. The eunuchs favored thin, braided cords of leather soaked in rosewater so the scent would mask any trace of blood. 20 lashes were enough to make a woman faint without marking the skin that might one day lie against the sultan's cheek. The punishment was carried out behind lattice screens in the hammam of the favorites or in the laundry courtyards where the constant hiss of steam swallowed every sound. 2 junior eunuchs held the offender by the arms while a third delivered the strokes with mechanical grace. No one raised their voice. The victim was warned that any cry would double the count. Most learned to bite their own wrists until they bled instead. Afterward, she was given sherbet laced with opium, dressed in fresh clothes, and returned to her duties as though nothing had happened. The next morning, she would serve coffee to the very women who had denounced her, smiling with swollen lips, walking on feet that still remembered every lash. For lesser infractions, a glance too bold, a letter smuggled, a rumor of pregnancy by someone other than the Sultan, the punishment was falaka. Falaka was beautiful in its economy. It left the face untouched, the hands soft, the body presentable within hours, yet it could break a spirit more thoroughly than any rack. The woman was laid on her back on a cushioned bench. Her ankles were tied together and passed through a loop of silk rope that was then hoisted until her feet pointed at the ceiling. A light cane, often a dried palm rib no thicker than a finger, was used. 10 strokes for gossip, 20 for disobedience, 50 for attempted escape. The pain was immediate and astronomical, traveling up the legs like lightning, exploding behind the eyes. Victims described it as being flayed from the inside. Yet within a day or two, the external bruising faded to yellow, and the woman could be displayed again, flawless. Some were expected to dance the same evening. They did, tears glittering like additional jewels as their swollen soles struck the marble in perfect rhythm. The court applauded the grace of their suffering. There were worse things than pain, of course. There was oblivion. When a woman became truly dangerous, when she knew too many secrets, loved too fiercely, or simply stood between a new favorite and absolute power, the palace preferred a death that left no trace and no scandal. Royal blood could not be spilled. Islamic law and Ottoman tradition both forbade it, so they used silk. Bowstring execution was an art refined over centuries. A deaf-mute eunuch chosen because he could never repeat a final plea entered the chamber after midnight carrying a silk cord the color of moonlight. The woman was usually asleep. If not, she was given a cup of sweetened coffee to calm her. She was made to kneel on a prayer rug facing Mecca, an irony no one ever dared mention. The cord was looped around her throat, crossed at the nape, and pulled tight with a single practiced motion. There was a soft crack like green wood snapping, 30 seconds, perhaps less. No blood, no scream, no mark except a faint reddish line that powder easily concealed. The body was wrapped in weighted silk sacks and carried down the palace's secret stairs to the shore where a boat waited. By dawn it rested on the bed of the Bosphorus, food for fishes that had feasted on royalty for 400 years. The chamber was aired with burning aloes. The bedding was burned. The jewelry was melted and recast. Within a week, another girl moved in, delighted by the view, unaware that the woman who had slept in that bed the previous month had been erased so thoroughly that even her perfume no longer lingered. Sometimes the name was struck from every register, as though she had been a dream the palace had decided to forget. Harem Sultan, Roxolana, understood this better than anyone. When she rose from Ruthenian slave girl to the first Hayski sultan in history, she did so across a carpet of disappeared rivals. Mahidevran, Gulfam, the unnamed Circassian with the violet eyes, the Persian beauty who sang like a nightingale. One by one, they vanished between 1526 and 1550. No chronicles record their deaths. No grave bear their names. Only the sudden silence in certain corridors, the way certain doors were suddenly locked forever, told the story. A century later, Kursum Sultan played the same game on an even grander scale. As valet to 3 sultans and regent for 2, she ordered the strangling of dozens, perhaps hundreds of women who threatened her bloodline. When she herself was finally murdered in 1651, it was not by silk but by bare hands and curtain cords in a frenzy of terror, yet even then her body was treated with the old respect. Wrapped, weighted, dropped into the sea before sunrise. These were the famous ones, the unnamed were legion. There was the girl from Crete who arrived in 1673 with hair the color of burnished copper and lasted exactly 9 months before she laughed too loudly at a Georgian rival and was never seen again. There was the Abkhazian beauty who bore Ibrahim the Mad a daughter in 1642 and was drowned 3 weeks later because the child's eyes were the same mad violet as his own. There was the entire cohort of Ahmed III's favorites who were locked in their apartments in 1730 when Patrona Halil's rebels stormed the palace. 39 skeletons were found behind bricked-up doors when the rooms were finally opened in 1839. The palace kept its secrets well, yet every so often a whisper escaped. Lady Mary Wortley Montagu, visiting in 1717, wrote in a letter home, "They told me there are above 300 women locked up in the higher apartments that have not seen sun or moon these 10 years past." Venetian ambassadors reported seeing women at windows who pressed their palms against the glass as though trying to push through centuries of silence. A French jeweler working on the Sultan's orders in 1770 claimed he was taken blindfolded to a hidden suite to repair a necklace for a princess no one would name, and that she wept without sound the entire time, tears falling onto diamonds worth a kingdom. The harem was demolished and rebuilt many times, but the deepest rooms, the ones without numbers, were simply sealed. When Topkapi became a museum in 1924, workmen breaking through a false wall in the third courtyard found a perfectly preserved apartment, divans still covered in faded silk, a chessboard with ivory pieces mid-game, a woman's slipper embroidered with seed pearls lying on its side as though its owner had just stepped out for a moment and never returned. The dust was so thick it rose like smoke when they entered. No one has ever identified whose room it was. Today tourists walk the courtyard of the favorites and admire the Iznik tiles, never noticing that certain windows are painted trompe-l'oeil because the real ones behind them look onto nothing. They photograph the golden road where the Sultan once strolled among his women, unaware that beneath their feet runs a narrow corridor where eunuchs once dragged bodies in the dark. They sip tea in the cafeteria built over the old laundry courts and never smell, beneath the tourist perfume, the ghost of rosewater and blood. The palace remembers everything. The marble has absorbed too many tears to ever be truly clean. At night, when the floodlights switch off and the cats take over the courtyards, guards still report hearing the soft pad of bare feet on stone, the rustle of silk that has no body inside it, the muffled sound of someone beating a cane against flesh long returned to dust. Behind the golden lattices, the women are still there, not as ghosts perhaps, but as silence made solid, as absence shaped into architecture. They never left. They were never allowed to, and the palace, vast and serene and merciless, simply closed its doors around them, turned its key, and let the centuries pass over their unheard voices like water over marble, smooth, cold, and forever unmarked.